What if the only person who can see you is the one who has every reason to hate you? A silver prison, a broken soul, and a love that costs everything. Would you reach into the dark? We are about to hear this story right now. The war had been over for 3 years, but the silence it left behind was louder than the screams ever were. Hermione Granger lived in that silence, filling it with the scratching of a quill and the dry scent of ancient parchment. As a senior researcher for the Department of Mysteries, her task was to catalogue the lost curiosities of the fallen pureblood estates, relics too dangerous to be sold, too cursed to be ignored. It was a Tuesday, a day of grey mist and the smell of damp stone, when she found it in the deepest vaults of Malfoy Manor. The mirror stood nearly 7 feet tall, its frame a twisted mass of blackened silver, carved into the likeness of thorns and weeping lilies. It didn't reflect the dusty cellar or the flickering light of Hermione's wand. It reflected nothing but a swirling, charcoal-coloured fog. "Another vanity piece," she whispered, her breath hitching in the cold. She reached out to brush a layer of grime from the glass, but her hand stopped inches away. The air near the surface didn't just feel cold, it felt hollow, as if the mirror were inhaling the warmth of the room. Hermione wiped the surface with her sleeve. The fog inside the glass didn't dissipate, it recoiled. And then a shape began to form. At first, she thought it was a trick of the flickering candlelight, a shadow perhaps. But then a hand pressed against the inner surface of the glass, long, pale fingers trembling slightly. Then came the face. Draco Malfoy looked as though he had been carved out of moonlight and grief. He was thinner than she remembered, his sharp cheekbones casting hollow shadows under eyes that were no longer the piercing silver of a storm, but the dull, aching grey of wood smoke. His white shirt was frayed at the collar, his hair a messy halo of platinum. He didn't speak. He couldn't. His lips moved, but no sound breached the crystalline barrier between them. Hermione's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Malfoy? The image of him flinched. His eyes widened, fixing on her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. He pressed his forehead against the glass, his eyes closing in what looked like an agonizing relief. "You've been missing for 2 years," she breathed, her fingers finally touching the glass. It was freezing, a biting chill that seeped into her bones. "The Ministry. Everyone thought you had fled to the continent, or that you were dead." He opened his eyes then. They were filled with a sudden, sharp flicker of the old Malfoy arrogance, quickly extinguished by a wave of desperation. He shook his head slowly, his gaze dropping to her hand on the glass. He traced the outline of her fingers from his side of the mirror, his touch leaving no warmth, only a faint shimmer in the fog. "How?" she asked, her analytical mind fighting through the fog of shock. "Is it a stasis curse? A mirror of erased variant?" He didn't answer. Instead, he began to move his finger against the glass. "SCRIBE," he traced in reverse so she could read it. Hermione fumbled for her wand, her fingers clumsy. With a quick gemino, she produced a piece of parchment and a self-inking quill. She pressed the parchment against the glass. "Tell me," she commanded, her voice regaining its authoritative edge despite the tremor in her knees. He watched her, his expression unreadable. There was a flicker of the old enmity there, the way his mouth thinned into a line of disdain, but it was softened by a profound, haunting loneliness. He began to write with his finger, the words appearing as frost on the inner surface. Blood for silence, the frost read. The coward's cage. Hermione felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. She knew the law. Certain ancient families practiced the sealing, a way to hide a disgraced heir from the world or to protect them from a fate worse than imprisonment. It was a magic fueled by the occupant's own guilt. "You did this to yourself?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. Draco's expression shifted. The repulsion was instantaneous. He stepped back into the charcoal mist, his face hardening into a mask of cold porcelain. He looked at her, not as a savior, but as a reminder of everything he had lost and everything he had failed to be. He turned his back to her, his silhouette fading into the grey. "Malfoy, wait. I can't help you if you retreat." He didn't turn back. He disappeared into the depths of the mirror's world, leaving her alone in the dark, damp cellar. Hermione stood there for a long time, the silence of the vault pressing in on her. She should report this. She should call the Aurors, let the Ministry handle the Malfoy problem. It was the logical, principled thing to do. But she looked at the spot where his hand had been, the faint, lingering shimmer on the glass, and felt a phantom ache in her own palm. He looked broken, not just imprisoned, but shattered. She gathered her things, her mind already racing through the titles of restricted books in the Hogwarts library. As she turned to leave, she cast one last look at the mirror. "I'm coming back tomorrow," she said to the empty glass. There was no response, only the sound of her own footsteps echoing against the stone. But as she climbed the stairs, she couldn't shake the image of his eyes. They hadn't looked at her with hate. Not exactly. They had looked at her like a drowning man looks at the shore, with a mixture of hope and the terrifying certainty that he will never reach it. That night, in her small flat in London, Hermione couldn't sleep. The smell of the vault, damp earth and ancient stagnant magic clung to her skin. She closed her eyes and saw the frost on the glass. The coward's cage. Why had he stayed silent? Why hadn't he reached out to his mother or the few friends he had left? Why was it her, the girl he had spent years tormenting, who found him? The mystery was a tether, pulling her back to the dark heart of Malfoy Manor. She told herself it was her duty as a researcher. She told herself she was simply being thorough. But as she watched the rain lash against her window, she knew it was more than that. It was the look in his eyes when he saw her, the moment the mask slipped and revealed the raw, bleeding humanity underneath. She would go back. She would find the key to the glass, and she would force Draco Malfoy to face the world he had tried so desperately to leave behind. She didn't know then that the mirror didn't just hold his body, it held his soul. And to break the glass, she would have to break the walls she had built around her own heart. The next day, the air in the manor's vault felt even heavier, thick with the scent of ozone and stagnant time. Hermione returned not with the Ministry's retrieval team, but with a satchel weighed down by 3 forbidden volumes on soul binding and a thermos of tea that felt absurdly domestic in the face of such ancient, dark magic. She approached the mirror with a tentative step, her boots clicking against the cold stone floor. "I know you're there, Draco," she said, her voice echoing in the hollow space. "I've spent the last 14 hours in the restricted section. I know this isn't a standard vanishing cabinet or a simple port key gone wrong. This is the speculum animae, the mirror of souls." For a long minute, there was only the swirling grey mist. Then, slowly, as if through a thick curtain of smoke, he appeared. He looked even more translucent than the day before, his skin the colour of parchment left in the rain. He was sitting on the floor of his cage, his back against the glass, his knees pulled up to his chest. He didn't look at her. He looked at the darkness behind him, a vast, empty expanse that seemed to stretch into eternity. "It's a blood ward, isn't it?" Hermione continued, kneeling so she was at eye level with him. She pressed her hand to the glass. This time she didn't flinch at the cold. A self-imposed exile. The Malfoy line used it during the witch hunts, a way to vanish when the world became too dangerous. But it requires a catalyst, guilt, shame, a rejection of the world outside. Draco turned his head slowly. His grey eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with a raw, agonizing exhaustion. He stood up, his movements fluid but hauntingly slow, like a man moving through deep water. He walked toward her until only an inch of enchanted glass separated their faces. "Clever Granger," he traced onto the glass. The frost was jagged, sharp, still the insufferable know-it-all. Hermione felt a flash of heat, not of anger, but of a strange, grounded familiarity. "And you're still the same arrogant boy who thinks he can hide from his problems in a dark room. Only this time, the room is a literal prison of your own making." His expression darkened. He slammed a fist against the glass. There was no sound, only the visual vibration of the impact. His lips curled into a silent snarl, and he began to write rapidly, his fingers flying across the surface. "You know nothing of what I am hiding from. You walked away as a hero. I walked away as a ghost. This isn't a hiding place. It's a sentence." "Then let me help you serve it outside," she countered, her voice softening. "The Wizengamot cleared you, Draco. Your mother is in France. The world is rebuilding. You don't have to stay in the dark." He laughed, a silent, jarring movement of his shoulders, and leaned his forehead against the mirror. He looked so incredibly fragile in that moment that Hermione felt a lump form in her throat. She reached out, tracing the line of his jaw through the glass. For a second, he didn't pull away. He leaned into the ghost of her touch, his eyes fluttering shut. The tension between them shifted. The sharp edges of their history seemed to blur in the dim candlelight. It was a moment of profound, wordless intimacy. Two enemies finding a strange sanctuary in each other's presence. But then the seesaw tilted. Draco's eyes snapped open. He saw the pity in her gaze, the bright, burning empathy of Hermione Granger, and it seemed to scald him. He recoiled, his face twisting into a mask of pure vitriol. He pointed a long finger at the mudblood scar on her arm, barely visible beneath her sleeve, and then at the dark mark he surely bore on his own. "We are not the same," he wrote, the letters large and ugly. "I am a monster in a cage. You are the girl who keeps looking at monsters expecting them to turn into princes. Leave. Your light is blinding." "I am not looking for a prince," she snapped, standing up, her heart stinging from the sudden rejection. "I am looking for a man who is too much of a coward to face his own life. If you want to rot in here, fine. Let the glass consume you. Let the silence take your voice forever." She turned to grab her bag, her breath coming in jagged gasps. The cold of the vault seemed to intensify, biting at her heels. She hated him. She hated how easily he could wound her with a look, how he could weaponize his own suffering to push her away. She reached the door of the vault when a frantic tapping stopped her. She froze. The sound was rhythmic, desperate. She turned back. Draco was pressed against the glass, both hands flat against the surface. He wasn't sneering anymore. He looked terrified. Behind him, the grey mist was changing. Dark, oily shadows were coiling in the corners of his prison, reaching out like tentacles. The mirror wasn't just a cage. It was starting to feed. "Don't go," he wrote. The frost was messy, trembling. "Please." The word "please" from Draco Malfoy felt like a physical blow. It was the first time she had ever seen him truly stripped of his pride. The cold of her anger vanished, replaced by a surge of protective instinct that defied logic. She ran back to the mirror, pressing her hands over his. "What is that?" she whispered, staring at the shadows behind him. "Draco, what is happening?" "The hunger," he traced. "The mirror demands a price for the silence. If I am alone too long, it begins to erase the parts of me that still remember the sun." Hermione felt a shudder run through her. She realized then that his repulsion wasn't just about her. It was a defense mechanism. He was trying to protect her from the darkness that was slowly claiming him. He was trying to be noble in the most twisted way possible. "I won't leave you," she promised, her voice steady despite the shadows dancing behind him. "I have to go to the ministry to get the arithmancy charts for the ward break, but I will be back. Do you hear me? I will be back tonight." He watched her, his eyes searching hers for a lie. He looked like a man who had forgotten what it was to be believed in. Slowly, he nodded. He touched the glass where her heart would be, a gesture so tender it made her breath catch. "Bring a light," he wrote. "It's getting so dark in here, Hermione." It was the first time he had ever used her name. Not Granger, not Mudblood, but Hermione. The sound of it, even written in frost, felt like a secret shared in the dark. She left the vault at a run, her mind spinning. The conflict within her was no longer about whether to save him, but about what it would cost her. She was becoming entangled in his darkness, her own light dimming as she reached into the glass. As she climbed out into the rain-soaked grounds of the manor, she felt a lingering chill on her fingertips. She looked down and saw a faint trace of frost on her skin. It didn't melt. It sat there, a mark of her connection to the man in the mirror. She knew she was breaking every rule, every principle she held dear. She was falling for a ghost, a shadow of a boy she used to hate, and the glass between them was starting to feel like the only thing keeping her sane, and the very thing that would eventually break her. The mission was clear, but the emotional cost was rising. She needed the charts, she needed the light, and most of all, she needed to know why her heart beat faster in a cold, dark vault than it ever had in the world above. The shadows were closing in, and the clock was ticking. If she didn't find a way to shatter the glass by dawn, Draco Malfoy wouldn't just be a prisoner, he would be a memory. The Ministry of Magic at 3 a.m. was a skeleton of itself, a labyrinth of cold tiles and echoing silence. Hermione moved through the archives like a phantom, her wand light a narrow, piercing beam that cut through the darkness of the restricted arithmancy stacks. She wasn't supposed to be here. She was bypassing 3 levels of security clearance, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Every shadow that flickered on the wall looked like a dementor. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like the footsteps of an approaching aura. But all she could see when she closed her eyes was Draco's face, the way his name for her had looked in the frost, trembling and desperate. Hermione. She found the scroll she needed, the geometry of reflection and the sundering of the soul glass. It was ancient, the parchment so brittle it felt like dried skin. As she unrolled it, a faint, sickly smell of decay wafted up. The equations were dizzying, a chaotic map of blood magic and intent. To break the speculum anime, one didn't just need a counterspell. One needed a tether, a physical and emotional anchor to pull the prisoner back into the realm of the living. "The price of the exit is the weight of the entry," she whispered, translating the archaic Latin. Her blood ran cold. The mirror didn't just hold him, it was feeding on his sense of self. To pull him out, she would have to give it something of her own, a memory, a piece of her vitality, a spark of her own light. She didn't hesitate. She shoved the scroll into her bag and slipped out of the ministry, the cool night air of London hitting her face like a slap. By the time she reached the gates of Malfoy Manor, the rain had turned into a torrential downpour. The grounds were a graveyard of drowned roses and skeletal trees. Inside the vault, the atmosphere had shifted from cold to suffocating. The candles she had left were guttering, their flames turned a sickly, bruised purple. "Draco!" she cried out, stumbling toward the mirror. The glass was nearly opaque now, covered in a thick, oily soot that seemed to pulse from within. She wiped it away frantically with her palms, her skin stinging as if she were touching dry ice. He was there, but he was fading. He was slumped against the inner wall, his eyes glazed, his skin almost grey. The coiling shadows she had seen earlier were no longer just in the corners. They were wrapped around his ankles, his wrists, pulling him back into the infinite nothingness of the mirror's depths. "Draco, look at me." She slammed her hands against the glass. "I found it. I know how to get you out." He looked up, but his gaze was vacant. He didn't recognize her. The mirror was winning. It was erasing the image of the girl who had been his only link to the sun. He reached out a hand, but it wasn't toward her. It was toward the darkness, as if he were finally ready to surrender. "No!" Hermione screamed. She pulled out her wand and began to chant, the arithmancy formulas spilling from her lips in a frantic, rhythmic cadence. The air in the vault began to hum. A silver light began to glow at the tip of her wand, growing brighter and hotter until it was blinding. She pressed her wand tip to the glass. "Revocate animam, redite ad lucem." The mirror shrieked, a high, glass-shattering sound that tore through the silence. Draco gasped, his back arching as the silver light flooded his prison. For a moment, the shadows recoiled. His eyes snapped into focus, locking onto hers. The recognition was like an electric shock. "Stop," he wrote, his finger shaking so hard the letters were barely legible. "It's taking yours. Look at your hand." Hermione looked down. Her hand, the one pressing against the glass, was turning translucent. The mirror was beginning to drain her, pulling her essence through the barrier to compensate for the life it was losing in Draco. The seesaw swung violently. from the warmth of hope to the freezing terror of self-destruction. "I don't care," she shouted, though her voice felt thin, as if she was speaking from underwater. "I'm not letting you go." "I am not worth this, Granger," he traced, his expression a tortured mix of love and self-loathing. "Let me fade. You have a life. You have the world. I am just a ghost of a war that should have ended with me." "Don't you dare," she sobbed, the effort to stay grounded making her vision swim. "Don't you dare decide what you're worth to me. You think this is just about some noble cause? You think I'm doing this for the ministry?" He froze, his hand hovering over the glass. "I'm doing this because I can't breathe when I'm not here," she confessed, the truth ripping out of her with a violence that surprised them both. "I'm doing this because you're the only person who looks at me and sees someone other than the brightest witch of her age. You see me, and I see you, Draco. Not the mark, not the manner, you." The silence that followed was heavy, charged with a tension so thick it felt like physical weight. Draco stared at her, his chest heaving. The shadows behind him hissed, sensing his hesitation. Slowly, deliberately, he pressed his palm against hers, separated only by the thinning veil of glass. The repulsion was gone, replaced by a desperate, soul-aching longing. For the first time, the cold of the mirror felt like it was melting. "If I come out," he wrote, "I have nothing. No name, no future." "You'll have me," she whispered, her forehead touching the cold glass. "Is that enough?" Draco's expression broke. The mask of the Malfoy heir, the pride of the pureblood prince, the armor of the cynical prisoner. It all shattered. He looked at her with a raw, terrifying vulnerability. He didn't write anything. He just nodded, a single, sharp movement. But as the silver light reached its peak, a sudden crack appeared in the center of the mirror. It wasn't a crack of release. It was a fracture of rejection. The mirror was fighting back. A surge of dark energy blasted Hermione backward, throwing her across the stone floor. She hit the wall hard, the world spinning into darkness. The last thing she saw before her eyes closed was Draco screaming her name, a silent, jagged cry of agony, as the oily shadows surged forward, swallowing him whole. The light died. The vault plunged into a cold, suffocating blackness. When Hermione finally regained consciousness, the air was still. She felt a phantom cold in her marrow. She scrambled to her feet, her body aching, and lunged for the mirror. It was empty. No mist, no shadows, no Draco. It was just a mirror now, reflecting a bruised, disheveled girl with tears tracking through the dust on her face. "Draco," she whispered, her voice cracking. She hit the glass. It was solid, unyielding, just glass. "Draco, answer me!" She spent hours screaming into the void, casting every spell she knew, but the mirror remained a silent, mocking reflection of her own despair. He was gone. The doubt she had felt earlier, the fear that she was chasing a ghost, returned with a vengeance. Had she killed him? Had her attempt to save him only accelerated his end? The cold was absolute now. She slumped against the base of the mirror, the smell of damp stone and extinguished candles wrapping around her like a shroud. She had failed. The war had claimed its final victim, and it was the only one she had truly tried to save for herself. She stayed there until the first grey light of dawn began to seep through the high, barred windows of the vault. She was hollowed out, a shell of the woman who had walked in the day before. But then she noticed it. On the very bottom corner of the frame, where the silver lilies were carved into the metal, there was a single drop of something dark. She reached out, her finger trembling. It wasn't ink. It wasn't frost. It was warm. It was blood. And as she touched it, a faint, rhythmic thud echoed through the stone floor. Not from the mirror, but from the wall behind it. A heartbeat. The mirror hadn't swallowed him. It had hidden him. Hermione's heart leapt. The conflict hadn't ended. It had simply moved deeper into the labyrinth of the manor. She stood up, her eyes blazing with a renewed, ferocious intent. "I'm coming, Draco," she breathed. "I'm coming for you." But as she reached for the hidden latch behind the frame, a cold voice rang out from the shadows of the vault entrance. "I'm afraid I can't let you do that, Miss Granger." Hermione spun around, her wand raised, to find herself staring into the cold, calculated gaze of a man who should have been in Azkaban, Lucius Malfoy's loyalist lawyer and the keeper of the family's darkest secrets. The struggle for Draco's soul was no longer just against the glass. It was against the very legacy that had put him there. The slow burn was about to turn into a forest fire. The man standing in the doorway was Corvinus Selwyn, a man whose soul was as grey as the stagnant air of the vault. He was the Malfoy family's primary solicitor, a wizard who dealt in the legalities of blood curses and the fine print of ancient wills. He stood with his hands folded over a silver-topped cane, his eyes tracking Hermione with the clinical detachment of a predator watching a wounded bird. "The mirror is not a toy for ministry researchers, Miss Granger," Selwyn said, his voice a dry rasp. "It is a private family matter, a repository for that which the Malfoys no longer wish to carry." "He's not a thing to be carried," Hermione spat, her wand tip trembling but held steady. "He is a human being. He's alive, and you've left him to rot in a sensory vacuum. That is a violation of every magical humanitarian law in the book." Selwyn stepped forward, the clicking of his cane on the stones sounding like a countdown. "On the contrary, Draco Malfoy chose his sanctuary. He sought the mirror to avoid the shame of a world that would never forgive him. And now you are attempting to drag him back into a light that will only burn him. Tell me, is this about justice, or is it about your own insatiable need to fix things that are beneath you?" The words stung because they tasted of the truth she feared most. Was she saving him, or was she indulging in a fantasy of redemption? The seesaw of doubt plunged her into a cold, dark place. She looked at the mirror, then back at Selwyn. "I'm not fixing him," she whispered. "I'm listening to him, something none of you ever did." "If you open that passage," Selwyn warned, gesturing to the wall behind the mirror, "you trigger the final collapse of the ward. The manor will recognize you as an intruder. It will seal itself. You will both be buried here, beneath tons of cursed stone, long before you reach the surface." "Then I suggest you move out of my way," Hermione said, her voice hardening. "Because I've survived a war, a torture session in the drawing room above our heads, and the hunt for Horcruxes. A little falling masonry isn't going to stop me." With a flick of her wand, she sent a stunning spell at Selwyn. He parried it with an effortless wave of his cane, but the distraction was all she needed. She lunged for the hidden latch behind the silver frame. Her fingers brushed the warm blood on the carving, and the wall groaned. The mirror slid aside with the sound of grinding teeth. Behind it lay a narrow, lightless tunnel that smelled of ozone and ancient dust. "Draco!" she called out, plunging into the dark. The tunnel was a claustrophobic nightmare. The walls seemed to breathe, the stone pulsing with a faint, sickly green light. Every step felt like walking through wet clay. The further she went, the more the air began to vibrate with the sound of Draco's internal monologue, a cacophony of whispers that weren't hers to hear. Coward, traitor, disappointment. Her eyes. Why does she look at me like that? Make it stop. "Draco, stay with my voice," she cried, her wand light flickering as the manor's wards began to sap her magic. The tunnel opened into a small circular chamber. It was the physical heart of the mirror's magic. There, suspended in a web of shimmering, translucent threads, was Draco. He wasn't behind glass anymore, but he was still unreachable. He was suspended inches off the ground, his head lolling, his eyes rolled back. The threads were anchored to his chest, right over his heart, and they were pulsing with a dark, rhythmic glow. He was the battery. His guilt was the fuel for the manor's remaining protections. "No," Hermione breathed, rushing to him. She tried to touch him, but a shock of cold energy threw her back. "Draco, wake up! You have to fight the tether!" He groaned, his eyes fluttering open. They were bloodshot and unfocused. When they finally landed on her, there was no joy, only a crushing, silent agony. "Go! Away!" he wheezed. His voice was a ruined thing, a ghost of the sharp, cutting tone he once used to command a room. "Granger, it's too heavy." "I can help you carry it," she said, crawling back to him, her hands reaching through the stinging sparks of the ward. "Give it to me. The guilt, the shame. Give it to me, Draco." You can't," he choked out. A tear tracked through the grime on his face. "You're too bright. It will extinguish you." "Let it try," she defied. She reached out and grabbed the threads. The pain was instantaneous. It wasn't physical pain. It was an emotional onslaught. Suddenly, she wasn't Hermione Granger in a vault. She was Draco Malfoy standing on the astronomy tower, watching Dumbledore die. She was Draco Malfoy kneeling at the Dark Lord's feet, feeling the skin of his arm burn. She was the boy who had no choice, the boy who was told he was a king while being treated like a slave. The weight of it was staggering. It felt like cold water filling her lungs. She gasped, her knees buckling, but she didn't let go of the threads. Through the haze of his memories, she felt his hand wrap around her wrist. It wasn't the cold touch of a ghost anymore. It was skin. It was sweat. It was the frantic, thudding pulse of a man who was terrified of being alone. "Stop," he begged, his face inches from hers. "Hermione, stop. It's killing you." "We do this together," she gasped, her eyes locking onto his. In that moment, the warmth returned with a ferocity that shattered the darkness. It was the heat of two souls colliding in a vacuum. She saw him, truly saw him, not as a project or a victim, but as the other half of a broken circle. They were both children of the war, both scarred by expectations, both tired of being symbols. The threads began to glow white, the dark energy being purified by the sheer stubborn force of her empathy. Draco's grip on her wrist tightened, his fingers digging into her skin, anchoring her to the world. "Look at me," she commanded, her voice a low, fierce hum. "Don't look at the past. Look at me." Draco's breath hitched. He stopped fighting the threads and started fighting for her. He reached out his other hand, cupping her face, his thumb brushing away the dust on her cheek. The look in his eyes had changed. The hopelessness vanished, replaced by a raw, burning hunger for life. "I see you," he whispered, his voice finally finding its strength. "I see you, Hermione." As the words left his lips, the threads snapped. The explosion of magic was silent but total. A shockwave of white light blasted outward, disintegrating the chamber, the tunnel, and the dark influence of the speculum animae. The manor groaned, the very foundations shaking as the blood wards collapsed. Above them, the ceiling of the vault began to crack, great shards of stone falling like black rain. "We have to go!" Hermione shouted, grabbing his hand. Draco stumbled, his legs weak from years of disuse, but he didn't let go. They ran through the collapsing tunnel, the air thick with dust and the smell of ancient magic dying. Behind them, the mirror shattered into a million tiny diamonds, its power spent, its prisoner finally free. They burst back into the main vault just as the doorway began to seal. Hermione dived through, dragging Draco with her, as the stone slammed shut with a final, definitive thud. They lay on the cold floor of the cellar, gasping for air, their chests heaving in unison. The silence that followed was different now. It wasn't the silence of a grave. It was the silence of a beginning. Hermione rolled onto her side, looking at the man beside her. Draco was lying on his back, staring up at the vaulted ceiling. He looked older, tired, and utterly human. He turned his head to look at her, and for the first time in his life, there was no smirk, no mask, and no wall. "You're a mad woman, Granger," he whispered, a faint, genuine smile touching his lips. "And you're a colossal pain in the neck, Malfoy," she replied, her heart finally slowing to a steady, hopeful beat. But the seesaw wasn't finished. As she reached out to touch his hand, she saw the dark shape of Corvinus Selwyn standing at the top of the cellar stairs, his wand levelled at Draco's heart. "The debt must be paid, Mr. Malfoy," Selwyn said coldly, "one way or another." The freedom they had just won was already under siege. Hermione stood up, moving in front of Draco, her wand raised. The battle for the mirror was over, but the battle for their future had just begun. "Next step," she whispered to Draco. "We get out of this cellar." "Together?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "Together." The air in the cellar had turned lethal. Selwyn's presence was a cold weight, a reminder that the world outside the mirror was just as cruel as the void within. He stood framed by the flickering light of the upper hallway, a silhouette of old-world malice. To him, Draco was not a man, but a ledger entry, a piece of the Malfoy estate that had to be balanced or erased. "The Ministry doesn't know he's alive," Selwyn said, his voice echoing like dry leaves. "And they won't. If he leaves this room, the Malfoy assets are seized, the lineage is ended, and my tenure as the steward of this legacy is over. You've been a very troublesome researcher, Miss Granger." Hermione felt Draco struggle to stand behind her. His hand caught her shoulder, using her for support. He was trembling, his muscles weak from years of stillness, but his grip was iron. The seesaw tipped toward repulsion, not of each other, but of the world that wouldn't let them breathe. "The legacy is already dead, Selwyn," Draco rasped, his voice gaining a jagged edge. "I broke the mirror. I broke the ward. There is nothing left for you to guard but a pile of cursed dust." Selwyn's eyes narrowed. "Then I shall guard the silence." He slashed his wand through the air. A streak of violet light, a curse designed to stop the heart without leaving a mark, hurtled toward them. Hermione's reaction was instinctive. She didn't just cast a shield charm, she threw her whole being into the magic. Protego totalum. The violet light splashed against her shield like water on hot iron. The force of it vibrated through her teeth. She could feel the drain on her magic, her reserves already low from the mirror's theft. "Run, Draco," she hissed. "I'm not leaving you to fight him alone," he snarled, his pride flaring up even in his weakened state. He fumbled for his wand in the pocket of his frayed trousers, the wand he had kept for 2 years in the dark. He flicked it, but only a few pathetic sparks emerged. His magic was as fractured as his mind. The frustration on his face was agonizing to see. He looked at his wand as if it were a traitor. "He's right, Granger," Selwyn sneered, stepping down the first few stairs. "He's a hollow shell. Move aside, and perhaps I'll let you live to write your report. Tell them he died in the glass. It's the neatest ending for everyone." "I don't do neat endings," Hermione countered. She launched a volley of stunning spells, her movements a blur of practiced precision. Selwyn was fast, moving with the grace of a man who had spent decades dueling in the shadows of the law. He deflected her spells with a bored flick of his cane, closing the distance between them. The tension in the room was suffocating. Hermione could smell the ozone, the old sweat on Draco's skin, and the metallic tang of Selwyn's dark magic. She was being pushed back, her boots skidding on the damp stone. Suddenly, Draco's hand was on hers. It wasn't a gesture of restraint. He wrapped his fingers around her wand hand, his palm pressing against the back of hers. The heat of him was startling. "Two minds," he whispered in her ear, his breath hot against her skin. "Like the mirror, use my intent. I can't channel it, but I can fuel you." The seesaw swung back to warmth, a fierce, desperate trust. Hermione didn't question him. She let him guide her arm, his superior height and reach providing a leverage she didn't have. She felt his magic, thinner than hers, but sharp and cold, bleed into her own. It was a chaotic, intoxicating sensation. "Expulso!" The spell that left her wand wasn't her usual measured charm. It was a roar of white-hot energy, amplified by Draco's desperation. It hit Selwyn's shield and shattered it like porcelain. The solicitor was thrown backward, his head cracking against the stone stairs. He slumped into a heap, his silver-topped cane clattering into the darkness. Silence fell, broken only by their synchronized ragged brethren. Draco didn't let go of her hand. He leaned his forehead against her shoulder, his chest heaving. "Tell me, you have a plan to get out of the grounds," he muttered. "I have a port key," she whispered, her heart racing not from the fight, but from the proximity of him. "But it's outside the gates. We have to walk." "I can walk," he said, though his legs buckled the moment he tried to take a step. Hermione caught him, sliding his arm over her shoulders. "You're a terrible liar, Draco." "It's a Malfoy trait," he joked weakly, though there was no humor in his eyes. They began the long, agonizing trek out of the cellar and through the manor's ground floor. The house was waking up. The portraits were screaming, their painted faces twisted in horror at the sight of the mud-blood carrying the air. The very walls seemed to shrink away from them, the shadows lengthening as if trying to trip them. As they reached the grand entrance hall, Draco stopped. He looked at the spot where he had seen his aunt torture her. He looked at the chandelier that had fallen. The seesaw hit a point of deep, agonizing doubt. "I can't go out there," he whispered, his gaze fixed on the front doors. "The world. They'll see me. They'll see what I am. They'll see a survivor," Hermione said firmly, her fingers tightening on his waist. "No," he said, pulling back slightly, his eyes wide with a sudden, sharp fear. "They'll see a Malfoy. They'll see the boy who sat at that table while people were murdered. I'm not like you, Hermione. I don't have a place in the brave new world." The cold returned, a wall of prejudice and self-loathing that he was building between them. He was trying to push her away again, trying to return to the safety of his cage, because the light was too honest. "You don't get to decide that for me," she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. She stepped into his space, forcing him to look at her. "I didn't pull you out of a soul-eating mirror so you could hide in a cellar of your own making. You think you're the only one with scars? Look at me, Draco." She pulled back her sleeve, revealing the mudblood scar. It was silver in the moonlight streaming through the windows. "We are both broken," she said. "But we can be broken together. Or you can stay here and let Selwyn wake up. Which is it?" Draco stared at the scar, his expression unreadable. He reached out, his fingers hovering just above the skin. He didn't touch it, but the look of pure, unadulterated regret in his eyes was more intimate than any touch could be. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "Don't be sorry," she said, her voice softening. "Be brave, just for the length of the driveway." He looked at the doors, then back at her. The seesaw leveled out into a tentative, fragile piece. He nodded, his jaws set in a line of grim determination. They stepped out into the night. The rain had stopped, leaving the world dripping and silver. The air was cold, but it felt like wine after the stagnant vault. They moved down the gravel path, two shadows silhouetted against the dark bulk of the manor. They were halfway to the gates when the first flare of red light lit up the sky. The ministry wards had been triggered. The auras were coming. "They're here," Draco said, his voice flat. "We have to reach the gate," Hermione urged, pulling him faster. "The port key is a rusted tin can under the oak tree, just another 100 yards. But Draco wasn't looking at the gates. He was looking at the horizon, where the first hints of dawn were beginning to bleed into the sky. He looked at her, his face pale and beautiful in the dying night. "If they catch us," he said, "they'll take me to Azkaban. You know that. Selwyn will make sure of it." "I won't let them," she promised. "You can't stop the law, Hermione." "I am the law," she shouted, her frustration boiling over. He laughed then, a real, genuine laugh that sounded like music. He stopped walking, pulling her into the shadow of a large stone gargoyle. "One thing," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. The tension between them, which had been building since she first wiped the dust off the mirror, suddenly reached a breaking point. He didn't wait for her to answer. He reached out and cupped her face, his hands cold but his touch searing. He leaned in, his eyes searching hers for a rejection that wasn't there. "Just so I remember what it feels like," he breathed. He kissed her. It wasn't the kiss of a hero or a lover. It was the kiss of a drowning man reaching for the surface. It tasted of salt, rain, and the metallic tang of magic. It was desperate, clumsy, and more honest than anything either of them had ever said. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. There was no manor, no ministry, no war. There was only the pressure of his lips against hers and the sudden, overwhelming warmth that flooded her chest. He pulled away, his eyes dark with a mixture of hope and terror. "Now," he said, his voice steady for the first time. "Let's go face the world." But as they turned to the gate, a dozen figures in red robes apparated into the clearing, their wands lit, their faces grim. The seesaw had one more drop to go. Hermione stepped forward, her hand firmly in Draco's, her head held high. She didn't know what would happen next, but as she looked at the silver light of the rising sun hitting the Aura's robes, she knew one thing for certain. The mirror was broken, and so were the chains of the past. "Stay behind me," she whispered to Draco. "Not a chance," he replied, stepping up to her side. The final part of their journey was about to begin, and it wouldn't be fought with mirrors or shadows, but with the cold, hard truth of who they had become. The arrival of the Auras was not a silent affair. The air crackled with the sharp, whip-like sounds of apparition, and suddenly the silver-drenched driveway of Malfoy Manor was swarming with red robes. The morning mist, which had felt like a protective shroud only moments before, now felt like a trap. Harry Potter stood at the head of the formation. His wand was lit with a steady white light, and his expression was a complicated tapestry of duty and bone-deep weariness. He looked at Hermione, dishevelled, bleeding from a scratch on her cheek, her hand locked in Draco Malfoy's, and his eyes widened behind his glasses. "Hermione!" Harry's voice was low, laced with a confusion that bordered on betrayal. "What is this? We received a distress signal from the Malfoy estate wards. They said an intruder was attempting to steal a high-security relic." Hermione didn't let go of Draco's hand. If anything, her grip tightened, her fingers digging into his cold skin as if she could anchor his soul to the earth by sheer force of will. "The only intruder here is the man I've left unconscious in the cellar, Harry. Corvinus Selwyn." The Auras shifted, their wands still trained on Draco. To them, he was a ghost, a criminal who had evaded the reckoning of the post-war trials. He was a shadow that had finally stepped into the light, and they were ready to extinguish it. "Malfoy," Harry said, his voice hardening. "You've been missing for 2 years. There's an active warrant for your questioning regarding the disappearance of several dark artifacts." Draco didn't flinch. The seesaw of his internal world had tilted into a strange, icy calm. He stood as tall as his weakened legs would allow, the aristocratic mask sliding back into place, though it was cracked and stained with the grime of his imprisonment. "I haven't been missing, Potter. I've been a guest of my own family's hospitality, though I wouldn't recommend the accommodations." "He was trapped, Harry." Hermione stepped forward, her voice ringing out with the authority of someone who had faced down gods and monsters. "The speculum animae. It's a soul-binding curse. He didn't flee, he was consumed. I pulled him out." The cold in the air was palpable. The Auras didn't lower their wands. They looked at Hermione with pity, as if she had finally succumbed to the weight of her own brilliance and gone mad. Trust, the very foundation of her relationship with her friends, began to fray in the damp morning air. "Hermione, step away from him," Harry commanded, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "We have to take him in. If what you're saying is true, He can explain it at the ministry. But right now, he's a fugitive. No, she said. The word a solid, immovable object. If you take him now, Selwyn's people in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement will ensure he never reaches a holding cell. He's a witness to a blood curse used for asset concealment. He's not a prisoner, Harry. He's a victim. Draco turned his head to look at her. The warmth of his gaze was so intense, it felt like a physical heat. He looked at the girl who was throwing away her reputation, her career, and perhaps her safety, all to defend a man who had once called her the foulest names in their language. "Why do you do it?" his eyes asked. "Because I saw you in the mirror," her silence answered. But the tension was far from resolved. One of the senior Aurors, a man named Savage who had lost a brother at the Battle of Hogwarts, stepped forward. "I don't care if he was trapped in a teapot, Granger. He's a Malfoy. He's got the mark and he's out of bounds. Move or we'll be forced to stun you both." "Savage, stand down," Harry barked, but the seeds of doubt had been sown. The repulsion Hermione felt for the system she had worked so hard to rebuild was overwhelming. She realized in that moment that the war hadn't ended for people like Savage. It had just moved into the offices and the courtrooms. Draco was the scapegoat they needed to feel like the world was finally right again. "If you want him," Hermione said, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried further than a shout, "you go through me. And I think you know exactly what I'm capable of when I'm protecting something." The stalemate was agonizing. The sun began to crest over the hills, turning the dew on the grass into a field of diamonds. Draco felt the weight of her sacrifice pressing down on him. He looked at the red robes, the wands, and then at the girl beside him. He moved suddenly, not away from her, but in front of her. He let go of her hand, and the loss of contact felt like a sudden drop in temperature. He stepped toward Harry, his hands raised, palms open. It was a gesture of total surrender, yet he had never looked more like a king. "Potter," Draco said, his voice steady, "I will go with you, on one condition." "You're in no position to make conditions, Malfoy," Savage growled. "I will go," Draco continued, ignoring the man. "Only if Hermione Granger is the one to escort me, and only if she is allowed to remain in the room during the questioning. She has the memories. She saw the mirror. If I go into that building alone, I won't come out. We both know that." Harry looked at Draco, really looked at him, for the first time in years. He saw the hollows under his eyes, the way his clothes hung off his frame, and the desperate, flickering life that Hermione had breathed back into him. He saw the enemies to lovers arc playing out in the wreckage of a pureblood dynasty, and for a moment the hero of the wizarding world felt a pang of profound envy for the clarity of their struggle. "Fine," Harry said, lowering his wand. "She stays with you, but you're going into magical restraints, Draco. No exceptions." "Harry, no!" Hermione protested, reaching for Draco's arm. Draco turned to her. He caught her hand one last time, his thumb grazing the pulse point at her wrist. "It's all right, Hermione," he whispered, his eyes soft with a tragic kind of peace. "Better a cage of iron than a cage of glass. At least in this one, I can hear your voice." The auras moved in. The cold of the silver shackles snapping around Draco's wrists echoed through the quiet morning. Hermione felt a betrayal of her own hopes. She had wanted to take him to her flat, to give him tea and a warm bed, to watch the sun rise without the threat of a cell. But as they led him toward the apparition point, Draco looked back over his shoulder. He didn't look at the manor, the house of his ancestors that had nearly become his tomb. He looked at her. The tension between them was no longer about hate or prejudice. It was about the distance they still had to travel. The seesaw had leveled, but the ground beneath them was still shaking. "I'll be there," she mouthed to him. He nodded once, a sharp, elegant movement. As the world dissolved into the high-pressure squeeze of side-along apparition, Hermione felt the lingering warmth of his kiss on her lips. It was the only thing that felt real. The ministry, the auras, the laws, they were just shadows on the wall of a cave. The only truth was the man who had been found in a mirror, and the girl who had been brave enough to look. The middle of their story was ending in a storm of bureaucracy and fear, but the fire had been lit, and as Hermione landed in the cold, sterile atrium of the Ministry of Magic, she knew that she wouldn't just be his escort. She would be his shield, his sword, and his way home. The conflict was no longer about the mirror. It was about the world's refusal to let a monster be redeemed. But Hermione Granger had always been very good at changing the world's mind. She straightened her robes, wiped the blood from her face, and walked toward the holding cells with the stride of a woman who had already won. The slow burn was reaching its zenith, and the ministry was about to find out exactly what happens when you try to take something away from the brightest witch of her age. The Ministry of Magic at dawn was a cavern of cold marble and echoing judgment. The air here didn't smell of rain or ancient dust. It smelled of sterile parchment and the sharp metallic tang of institutional magic. Draco was led through the atrium, the silver restraints on his wrists clinking with every step. He walked with a ghost of his former stride, a hollowed-out elegance that drew the stares of early shift workers. They whispered behind their hands, their eyes darting from the fallen Prince of Slytherin to the golden girl who walked half a step behind him, her jaw set like granite. The seesaw of their journey had reached a perilous height. In the vault, they were two souls against the dark. Here, they were a criminal and his defender. The intimacy of the kiss beneath the gargoyle felt 1,000 miles away, a dream swallowed by the harsh, unflattering glow of the ministry's enchanted windows. They were taken to a small, windowless interrogation room in level 2. It was a space designed to shrink the spirit. The walls were a dull, oppressive grey, and a single wooden table sat in the center, etched with anti-tampering runes. "Sit," Savage commanded, his hand heavy on Draco's shoulder. Draco sat. He looked at the table, his hands, shackled and pale, resting on the wood. He didn't look at Hermione. He seemed to be retreating again, pulling the shutters down over his mind to protect himself from the scrutiny of the room. The cold was returning, a defensive wall built of centuries of Malfoy pride. "Out," Hermione said, her voice cutting through the room's tension. Savage scoffed. "I don't think so, Granger. This is a high-security deposition." "Harry," Hermione said, turning to her friend who stood by the door. "You gave your word. The room belongs to me and the witness. You can watch through the glass if you must, but if you want the truth about Selwyn and the speculum animae, you will leave us." Harry hesitated, looking between the defiant fire in Hermione's eyes and the slumped, broken figure of his childhood rival. He nodded slowly. 10 minutes, Hermione. Then the department head will be here." The door clicked shut, leaving them in a silence so heavy it felt as if the room were underwater. Hermione didn't sit. She walked around the table, her shadow falling over Draco's hands. "Look at me, Draco," she whispered. He didn't move. "You should have left me in the driveway," he said, his voice a flat, dead thing. "You've done your duty. You saved the life. Now go back to your world before the soot from mine ruins your reputation." "Is that what you think this is?" she asked, the seesaw dipping into a sharp, stinging anger. "A project, a chore." "It's what it has to be," he snapped, finally looking up. His grey eyes were turbulent, filled with a self-loathing so deep it made her heart ache. "Look at where we are. Look at these." He rattled the silver chains. "I am a Malfoy in a cage. You are the hero of the piece. There is no version of this story where we walk out of here together. You're fighting for a ghost, Hermione. And ghosts belong in mirrors." The repulsion in his voice was a shield, a desperate attempt to hurt her so she would leave before he had to watch her be pulled away by force. But Hermione knew him now. She had seen the architecture of his soul. She reached out and covered his shackled hands with hers. The metal was freezing, but his skin was burning. "I am not fighting for a ghost. I am fighting for the man who told me he couldn't breathe when I wasn't there. I am fighting for the man who kissed me because he wanted to remember what it felt like to be alive." Draco flinched as if she had struck him. He tried to pull his hands away, but she gripped them tighter, her fingers threading through the links of his chains. "Don't you dare go back into the dark," she commanded, her face inches from his. "Don't you dare let them win by becoming what they expect you to be. You are more than your name. You are more than your guilt." The tension between them was electric, a slow burn agony of "can't stand it" and "can't help but think." Draco's breath hitched. He leaned forward, his forehead almost touching hers. The scent of him, ozone and cold stone, wrapped around her. "Why?" he whispered, his voice breaking. "After everything. Why me?" "Because you were the only one who didn't look at me like a statue," she confessed, her voice thick with emotion. "In that vault, when you looked at me, I wasn't the brightest witch or a war heroine. I was just Hermione. And I've never felt more seen than when I was looking at you through a sheet of cursed glass." The warmth flooded back, a sudden, overwhelming surge of trust that shattered his remaining defenses. Draco's eyes closed, and he let out a long, shuddering breath. He turned his hands over beneath hers, his palms pressing against hers as much as the restraints would allow. "If I stay," he whispered, "if I fight, I have nothing to give you but the wreckage of a life. Then we'll build something new from the ruins," she promised. The door burst open. Kingsley Shacklebolt, the minister himself, walked in, followed by a flurry of clerks and aurors. The moment of intimacy was severed like a snapped thread. Hermione stood up, smoothing her robes, though her eyes remained locked on Draco for a heartbeat longer, offering him a silent tether of strength. The interrogation began. It was a grueling, clinical assault on Draco's memory. They asked about the mirror, about Selwyn's involvement, about the assets hidden within the manor's walls. Draco answered with a calm, surgical precision, guided by the glances he shared with Hermione. The conflict was no longer internal. It was a battle against the bureaucracy of the wizarding world. Selwyn's lawyers arrived, attempting to claim Draco was mentally unfit, that he had been corrupted by the mirror's dark magic. They tried to paint Hermione as a victim of a prolonged enchantment. "I assure you, I am quite sane," Hermione said, standing before the council. She pulled the pensive memories from her temple, the silver threads of Draco's suffering, the oily shadows of the mirror, the blood on the frame. The only enchantment in that vault was the one Draco Malfoy broke himself when he chose to save me rather than disappear. The seesaw swung one final time toward doubt as the council deliberated. Draco was taken to a holding cell, and Hermione was barred from following. She spent the night in the atrium, pacing the fountain, her mind a storm of arithmancy and legal precedents. She thought of his kiss, the desperation of it, the way it had tasted of a life he had almost lost. She realized then that she didn't just want him free, she wanted him whole. By the second dawn, the verdict was reached. The Ministry could not ignore the evidence of Selwyn's illegal use of the speculum animae. The Malfoy assets were to be audited, yes, but Draco was to be released into a restricted parole, under the supervision of a Ministry-appointed guardian. When Harry came to find her in the atrium, he looked like he hadn't slept in a week. "He's being processed for release, Hermione. But there's a catch. He has to stay within a 5-mile radius of a designated monitor, someone with the magical capacity to suppress the mirror's lingering effects if they resurface." "I'll do it," she said before he could finish. Harry smiled, a small, knowing thing. "I already told them you would. He's waiting for you at the side entrance, away from the press." Hermione ran. She didn't care about decorum or the stares of the clerks. She ran through the golden halls, down the lifts, and out into the crisp morning air of London. He was standing by a black iron railing, his silhouette sharp against the rising sun. He was wearing a new cloak, charcoal grey, heavy and warm. The silver chains were gone, leaving only the faint red marks on his wrists. He turned as she approached. The tension between them had changed. It was no longer the tension of a wire about to snap, but the tension of a bow being drawn, aimed at a distant, hopeful horizon. "Granger," he said, his voice carrying a hint of the old, playful drawl, though his eyes were still filled with the weight of the mirror. "Malfoy," she replied, stopping inches from him. "I hear I'm your responsibility now," he said, stepping closer. The cold of the world felt distant, irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was the warmth of the man standing in front of her. A dangerous, cursed former Death Eater in the care of the Ministry's finest. "Are you sure your heart can handle the stress?" "I think I've proven my heart is quite resilient," she said, her voice dropping. The street was quiet. The city was waking up around them, but they were in a bubble of their own making. Draco reached out, his fingers brushing the hair away from her face. He looked at her with a look that was part reverence, part hunger, and entirely, authentically him. "Find me in the mirror," he whispered, echoing her thoughts from the vault. "You found me, Hermione, even when I didn't want to be found." The final resolution was inches away. The slow burn was about to become a flame. But as he leaned in, his lips a breath away from hers, she saw the shadow of a smile on his face. A real smile, one that reached his eyes. "I'm not a ghost anymore," he breathed. "No," she said, closing the distance. "You're home." One kiss remained to seal the truth, but the story wasn't over. It was just shifting into a new key. The first week of Draco's freedom was a study in shadows and light. He was living in a small ministry-sanctioned annex near Hermione's flat, a place of clean lines and white walls that felt, to him, like a different kind of void. The transition from the charcoal mist of the mirror to the vibrant, noisy reality of London was a violent sensory assault. He flinched at the sound of the kettle. He stared at the sun as if it were a miracle he wasn't allowed to touch. Hermione visited him every evening. She brought books, tea, and the grounding weight of her presence. The seesaw of their relationship had entered a new phase, a fragile approach where every touch felt like a question. The repulsion was gone, replaced by a deep, mutual fear of breaking the peace they had fought so hard to secure. Tonight, the rain was back, a gentle drumming against the windows of his sitting room. Draco was standing by the glass, his reflection superimposed over the wet streetlights of London. Hermione watched him from the doorway. He looked stronger, his frame filling out, but there was still a haunted quality to the way he held his shoulders, as if he were expecting the glass to swallow him again. "You're doing it again," she said softly, entering the room. Draco didn't turn. Doing what? Looking for a way back in. Or checking to see if you've already fallen. He let out a short, dry breath that wasn't quite a laugh. "It's a hard habit to break, Granger. 2 years of silence makes the noise of the world sound like a scream. Sometimes I think I left the best part of me behind that silver frame." Hermione walked over to him, stepping into the narrow space between him and the window. She forced him to look at her, not the glass. "The best part of you is standing right here, the part that chose to stay when the mirror offered you an easy exit." The tension between them shifted, thickening with the unspoken words of the last 7 days. The slow burn had reached its limit. The air was heavy with the scent of damp wool and the faint, citrusy magic that always clung to Hermione. Draco's gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes. The internal conflict was visible in the way his jaw tightened, the struggle between the boy who thought he deserved nothing and the man who wanted everything. "I don't know how to be the person you see," he whispered. "I'm a collection of mistakes held together by your stubbornness." "Then let me be stubborn for both of us," she replied, her voice a low, fierce hum. She reached out, her fingers tracing the faded marks on his wrists where the ministry restraints had been. It was a non-verbal intimacy, a silent acknowledgement of the pain they had shared. Draco shivered under her touch, his eyes fluttering shut. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, their breaths mingling in the quiet room. "I can still feel the cold sometimes," he admitted, his voice barely audible over the rain. "In my bones, like I'm still made of frost." "Then let me warm you," she said. She didn't wait for him this time. She reached up, her hands sliding into the silk of his platinum hair, and pulled him down. The kiss was the resolution of every doubt, every fear, and every seesaw of repulsion and warmth they had endured. It wasn't the desperate, salt-stained kiss of the driveway, nor the clinical contact of the vault. This was a slow, deliberate claiming. It tasted of peppermint tea and the lingering electricity of their combined magic. Draco groaned low in his throat, his hands coming up to grip her waist, pulling her flush against him as if he were trying to merge their very atoms. He kissed her with a hunger that spoke of years of starvation, not just for touch, but for the validation of his existence. Hermione met him with equal fervour, her heart hammering a frantic, joyful rhythm against his chest. In this embrace, the enemies to lovers trope finally shed its skin, leaving behind two survivors who had found a home in the one person they were never supposed to love. Draco pulled back just an inch, his lips wet and swollen, his grey eyes burning with a light that had nothing to do with the mirror. "Hermione," he breathed, the name a prayer. "I'm here," she whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." He kissed her again, deeper this time, his tongue tracing the line of her teeth, a silent promise of a future that didn't involve vaults or shadows. He led her toward the small sofa, the candlelight casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The cold of the Malfoy legacy, the warmth of the Gryffindor fire, they bled together until there was only the heat of the present moment. They spent the night in the quiet intimacy of shared silence. No more writing on glass, no more shouting through barriers. They sat together, her head on his shoulder, his arm draped protectively around her. Draco watched the way the firelight played on her skin, marveling at the fact that she was real, that he was real, and that the world hadn't ended because a Malfoy and a Granger had found peace. "What happens tomorrow?" Draco asked, as the first light of dawn began to grey the edges of the room. "Tomorrow," Hermione said, her eyes closing in exhaustion and contentment. "We go to the Ministry and we tell them that the audit is complete, and then we go for a walk in the park, without any auras, without any mirrors." Draco looked at the window. For the first time, he didn't see a prison. He saw a window. He saw the world outside, messy, judgmental, and complicated, and he didn't want to hide from it anymore. "I think I'd like that," he said. He leaned down and pressed a final soft kiss to her temple. The seesaw had stopped. The weight was balanced. The boy from the mirror had been found, and the girl who found him had finally realized that the mystery she was solving wasn't about a curse or a relic. It was about her own capacity to forgive, to love, and to see the gold hidden beneath the blackened silver of a ruined life. As the sun rose over London, the mirror in the vault of Malfoy Manor remained shattered, its pieces dull and lifeless. The magic was gone, because the heart that fed it had found a better place to beat. Draco Malfoy was no longer a reflection. He was a man, standing in the light, holding the hand of the only woman who had ever dared to look past the glass. And as Hermione fell into a deep, dreamless sleep in his arms, she knew that the story didn't need a neat ending. It just needed them. The slow burn had ended, but the fire would keep them warm for a long, long time. The transition from the shadow of the manor to the blistering light of the Ministry's social calendar felt like stepping from a tomb onto a stage. The Ministry Gala was an exercise in performative peace, a sea of emerald silk and gold embroidery designed to mask the lingering sense of war. For Hermione, it was a tactical necessity, a way to cement Draco's status as a rehabilitated citizen. For Draco, it was a walk toward a firing squad. They stood at the threshold of the great atrium, the air vibrating with the hum of 1,000 voices and the tinkling of enchanted crystal. The smell of expensive perfume and fire whiskey was stifling. "You don't have to do this," Hermione whispered, her hand resting on the sleeve of his black dress robes. The fabric was fine wool, a far cry from the frayed rags he had worn in the glass, but he still felt exposed. Draco adjusted his cuffs, his fingers trembling slightly. The seesaw of his nerves was at a breaking point, the cold of his past and the warmth of her hand fighting for dominance. "If I hide, I'm still in the mirror, Hermione. I'd rather be hated in the light than forgotten in the dark." As they stepped into the room, the silence didn't fall all at once. It rippled outward like a stone dropped into a pond. Conversations withered, heads turned. The tension was a physical pressure, a wall of judgment that Draco felt in the center of his chest. He saw the way women pulled their skirts back as he passed, and the way men reached for their wands out of habit. "Breathe," Hermione commanded, her voice a low anchor. They were approached by a group of junior ministry officials, men who had come of age after the war, their faces untainted by the memories of the astronomy tower. They looked at Draco with a mixture of morbid curiosity and disgust. "I heard the ministry has a new pet," one of them said, a boy with a high, pinched voice and a tie that was too tight. He didn't look at Draco, he looked at Hermione. "Tell me, Granger, is he house-trained, or does he still have a habit of bowing to the wrong masters?" Draco's face went white. The repulsion was instantaneous, a surge of the old defensive Malfoy pride that urged him to strike back with a barbed comment about the boy's lineage. He felt his magic stir, cold and jagged beneath his skin. But then he felt Hermione's fingers slide between his. She didn't look at the boy with anger. She looked at him with a profound, terrifying boredom. "I've fought dragons, Death Eaters, and the Dark Lord himself," she said, her voice echoing in the sudden pocket of silence. "If you think your mediocre insults have any weight here, you're more delusional than the people who thought the war was over in '98. Move aside." The boy flushed crimson and stepped back. Hermione didn't stop. She led Draco through the crowd, her head held high, her grip on his hand an unbreakable vow. They reached the balcony where the air was cooler and the noise of the gala was muffled by the night. The seesaw swung toward warmth. Draco leaned against the stone railing, his chest heaving as he stared out at the London skyline. The Muggle city was a carpet of amber lights, blissfully unaware of the ghosts of the wizarding world. "They'll never see me as anything else," he said, his voice fractured. "I'm the boy who lived to regret it. To them, I'm just a cautionary tale in a nice suit." "Let them look," Hermione said, stepping into his space. She leaned against the railing beside him, their shoulders touching. The show, don't tell of her loyalty was in the way she didn't look back at the room. She was looking at him. "The world is slow to change, Draco, but it doesn't matter what they see in the mirror. It matters what you see when you look at me." He turned to her then. The moonlight caught the silver in his hair and the deep, aching grey of his eyes. The tension between them, which had been a wire of survival for so long, finally began to melt into something softer. He reached out, his thumb brushing a stray curl from her forehead. "I see my life," he whispered. The non-verbal intimacy of the moment was profound. He didn't need to apologize for his past, and she didn't need to promise him a future. It was all there in the way he leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. They stood like that for a long time, two silhouettes against the vastness of the city. The seesaw leveled. The doubt that had plagued them since the vault, the fear that their bond was merely a product of trauma, was silenced by the steady, rhythmic beat of the night. "Dance with me," he said suddenly. "Here?" she asked, glancing back at the crowded ballroom where the music was swelling into a waltz. "No, here, where they can't see." He took her hand and placed the other on her waist. There was no music on the balcony, only the distant hum of the city and the sound of the wind through the eaves of the ministry. They began to move, a slow, unpracticed dance. Draco's movements were hesitant at first, his body still learning how to be fluid without the threat of a curse. He pulled her closer, his face buried in the crook of her neck. He breathed in the scent of her, parchment, vanilla, and the clean smell of the rain that had finally stopped. For the first time, the cold of the mirror was entirely gone. In its place was a burning, grounded heat. "You're a terrible dancer, Granger," he murmured against her skin. "You're out of practice, Malfoy," she countered, her arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him down until their lips were a breath apart. The kiss that followed was a slow burn, a transition from the desperation of their previous encounters to a deep, quiet certainty. It was a kiss that spoke of Mondays and morning tea, of quiet libraries and long walks. It was the sound of a door closing on the past and a window opening on the sun. When they eventually went back inside, they didn't look for approval. They didn't look for forgiveness. They walked through the atrium like people who had already won the only war that mattered. The conflict of public opinion hadn't been resolved. The whispers would continue, and the ministry would always be a place of judgment. But as Draco held the door for her, his hand lingering on the small of her back, the seesaw had stopped moving. They were no longer victims of their history. They were the architects of their own peace. As they stepped out into the cool London night, Draco looked up at the moon. It was the same moon he had watched from the cellar, the same moon that had been a blurred smudge in the mirror's fog. But now it was clear. It was real. "Where to?" he asked. "Home," she said. And for the first time in his life, Draco Malfoy knew exactly where that was. The trial of public opinion had ended, not with a verdict, but with a departure. They left the ministry behind, their footprints on the wet pavement the only evidence of their passing. The night was vast, the world was wide, and for the first time, the glass was not a prison, but a horizon. Part 10 was calling, a return to the heart of the darkness to extinguish the final flame. But for now, in the quiet of the London streets, they were just two people walking together into the light. The iron gates of Malfoy Manor did not groan as they once had. They swung open with a heavy, mournful silence, as if the estate itself had grown weary of its own history. The air on the grounds was thick with the scent of overgrown boxwood and damp earth, a garden that had forgotten the touch of a gardener. Hermione felt the familiar prickle of the ancient wards against her skin, but they no longer bit. They were toothless, shorn of their malice by the collapse of the mirror's core. Beside her, Draco stood rigid. His black coat was buttoned to the chin, a shield against the ghosts that haunted the very air of his childhood. This was the restoration of the heart, the final descent into the belly of the beast to ensure the fire was truly out. "It smells of rot," Draco said, his voice a low vibration in the still afternoon. "Even the air here feels like it's waiting for a funeral." "It's waiting for a change," Hermione corrected softly. She didn't reach for his hand this time. She knew this was a path he had to walk with his own feet, even if she was the shadow at his side. They entered the manor. The great hall was a cathedral of dust motes dancing in the shafts of grey light. The long mahogany table, where the darkest councils of the war had been held, sat like a skeletal remain. Draco stopped at the head of the table. He looked at the chair where Voldemort had sat, then at the floor where his father had knelt in disgrace. The seesaw tipped violently toward repulsion. He looked at his hands, as if expecting to see blood blooming beneath his fingernails. "I can still hear the screaming, Hermione. Every time the wind catches the eaves, I think it's Charity Burbage. I think it's you." The silence that followed was heavy with the show don't tell of their shared trauma. Hermione walked to the spot where she had been held down, where the word mudblood had been carved into the fabric of her reality. She stood there, her head tilted back, absorbing the coldness of the stone. "Then we replace the sound," she said. They descended into the cellar. The air grew colder, the light dimmer, until they reached the vault. The shards of the speculum animae still lay scattered across the floor like frozen tears. The frame, once a masterpiece of silver lilies and thorns, was now tarnished and bent, its magic extinguished. Draco approached the pedestal. He looked at the empty space where he had spent 2 years of his life as a silent observer of his own decay. The conflict here was the final tether, the guilt that told him he deserved to be back behind the glass. "I need to give it back," he whispered. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the Malfoy signet ring. The heavy gold band, etched with the family crest, glittered in the light of Hermione's wand. It was a symbol of centuries of pride, prejudice, and blood purity. It was the weight that had dragged him into the mirror in the first place. He knelt, not in prayer or submission, but in a final act of divestment. He placed the ring on the stone floor in the center of the shattered glass. "I am the last of the line," he said, his voice steadying. "And I am the one who ends it. The debt is paid. The cage is empty." As the ring touched the stone, a faint, crystalline hum echoed through the vault. It wasn't a curse. It was a release. The final thread of the blood ward snapped, and the oppressive weight that had hung over the manor for generations seemed to lift. The air suddenly felt lighter, the cold receding like a tide. The seesaw swung toward warmth. Hermione stepped forward and knelt beside him. She placed her hand over his on the cold stone, their fingers entwined over the discarded ring. The silence was no longer hollow. It was a sanctuary. "Let's go back up," she said. "The sun is still out." They didn't leave the manor immediately. Instead, they went to the east wing, to a small walled courtyard that had once been his mother's private sanctuary. It was a ruin of dead vines and grey stone, but the soil was still rich. Hermione pulled a small charmed pouch from her bag. "I brought something from the Longbottom's greenhouse." She handed him a handful of seeds, thick, dark husks that felt warm to the touch. White roses, but a different kind. They bloom even in the winter. They're called the survivor's breath. Draco looked at the seeds, then at the grey courtyard. He knelt in the dirt, his expensive robes staining with soil, and began to dig. He didn't use magic. He used his hands, his fingers pushing into the earth, feeling the grit and the life beneath the surface. Hermione joined him, her movements synchronized with his. This was the restoration. They weren't just burying seeds. They were burying their enemies' part of their history. Every handful of earth was a non-verbal intimacy, a shared labor of hope. The tension between them was no longer about what had been done, but about what could grow. When the last seed was planted, Draco stood up, his hands covered in mud. He looked at Hermione, her hair a wild halo, her face smudged with dirt, her eyes bright with a ferocious, beautiful life. "I don't think I'll ever be good, Hermione," he said, the honesty of the statement cutting through the afternoon air. "I'm always going to be the man who let the darkness in." "Good is a boring word, Draco," she replied, stepping close enough to brush a streak of mud from his cheek. "Be real. Be here. That's all I've ever asked of you." He pulled her into a hug, his mud-stained hands careful not to ruin her coat, though she didn't seem to care. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of the earth and the woman who had refused to let him fade. The seesaw was silent. The balance was found. As they walked back through the great hall toward the front doors, the manor felt different. It was still a tomb, perhaps, but it was no longer a prison. It was just a house made of stone and memories, and they were the ones who held the keys to the exit. "I'm never coming back here," Draco said as they reached the iron gates. He didn't say it with hate, but with the quiet finality of someone closing a book they had already finished reading. "I know," Hermione said. They stepped out onto the road, the gates swinging shut behind them with a definitive metallic click. The sun was dipping toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold, the colors of a bruise that was finally healing. Draco stopped and looked at her. He reached out and cupped her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. The warmth between them was absolute, a fire that had been forged in the coldest vault in Britain and was now strong enough to burn on its own. "Thank you," he whispered, "for finding me." "Thank you for being there to be found," she replied. They walked away from the manor, two figures disappearing into the long shadows of the evening. The restoration of the heart was complete. The past was a pile of shattered glass in a dark room, and the future was a garden that was already beginning to take root in the soil of their shared life. One chapter remained, the final reflection of who they had become when the world stopped watching and the quiet began. And in that quiet, they would find that the mirror was no longer necessary, for they were finally brave enough to look at each other. Part 11 was the ending, the happy, hard-won peace of a love that had survived the looking glass. 6 months later, the world had shrunk to the size of a small, sun-drenched flat in a quiet corner of London. It was a space defined not by bloodlines or ancient curses, but by the smell of roasting coffee, the chaotic stacking of books on every available surface, and the soft, rhythmic scratching of a quill. Hermione sat at the kitchen table, her brow furrowed over a complex arithmancy chart for her new project on restorative charms. The morning light filtered through the window, catching the steam rising from her mug. It was a mundane, beautiful piece. There was no frost on the windows, no oily shadows in the corners. There was only the sound of the city waking up and the steady breathing of the man in the next room. Draco emerged from the bedroom, wearing a soft grey jumper that made him look approachable, almost vulnerable. He had regained the weight the mirror had stolen. His shoulders were broad again, his movements fluid and grounded. He didn't look like a pure-blood prince or a prisoner. He looked like a man who had finally learned how to inhabit his own skin. He walked over to her, his hand sliding naturally onto her shoulder. He didn't speak immediately. They had long ago mastered the language of silence. He simply stood there, his thumb tracing a slow, absent-minded circle against the fabric of her shirt. The seesaw of their relationship had finally stilled. The repulsion of the past was a distant memory, a story they told to remind themselves of how far they had climbed. The doubt was gone, replaced by a trust so deep it felt like a part of their anatomy. "You're overthinking the third variable again," Draco murmured, his voice low and gravelly with sleep. Hermione huffed, though a smile tugged at her lips. "I am not overthinking. I am being thorough. The resonance between the intent and the manifestation is delicate. It's not an equation, Hermione. It's a pulse," he said, leaning down to look at her parchment. He tapped a finger against a cluster of numbers. "You're trying to force the magic to be logical, but magic like this, it's like what you did in the vault. It's a choice." She looked up at him, her heart doing that familiar, fluttering dance. Even after months of waking up beside him, the intensity of his gaze still had the power to render her breathless. "When did you become the expert on the philosophy of intent?" "When I spent 2 years with nothing but my own intentions for company," he replied, his expression softening into something so tender it made her throat tight. He moved to the counter to pour himself a cup of coffee, his movements effortless. He had found a job at a high-end apothecary in Diagon Alley, specializing in the stabilization of volatile ingredients. He was good at it, precise, patient, and quietly brilliant. The wizarding world still watched him, still whispered when he passed, but he had learned to treat the whispers like the wind, inevitable but unable to move him. "I have something for you," Draco said, setting his mug down. He reached into the pocket of his trousers and pulled out a small object wrapped in a silk cloth. He placed it on the table in front of her. Hermione unwrapped it carefully. It was a small, hand-held mirror, the frame carved from pale rowan wood and inlaid with tiny, iridescent pearls. It was light, delicate, and hummed with a soft, benevolent energy. "Draco, it's beautiful," she breathed, picking it up. "Look into it," he urged. She raised the mirror to her face. At first, she saw only her own reflection, the mess of her curls, the ink stain on her chin. But then, the glass shimmered. The image didn't change her features. It changed her surroundings. In the reflection, she saw the kitchen, but it was filled with flowers. The white roses they had planted at the manor, blooming in jars on the windowsill. She saw Draco behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist, his face buried in her neck. But it wasn't a vision of the future. It was a reflection of the now. "It's a presence glass," Draco explained, his voice thick with a sudden raw emotion. "I spent weeks on the enchantment. It doesn't show you what you want or what you fear. It shows you the truth of your own happiness. It shows you that you aren't a ghost, and neither am I." Hermione looked from the mirror to the man standing before her. The show, don't tell of his love, was etched into every line of the frame, in every hour he had spent perfecting the magic to ensure she never felt the cold of the vault again. The tension between them surged, not as a conflict, but as a magnetic pull. She stood up, the chair scraping against the floor, and threw her arms around his neck. The mirror was forgotten on the table as she pulled him down into a kiss that was the absolute resolution of their journey. This kiss was different from all the others. It wasn't a rescue. It wasn't a desperate plea. It was a celebration. It tasted of home, of the sun hitting the pavement after a long rain, of the quiet certainty that they had fought for this peace and won. Draco's hands were steady on her back, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world, which, to him, she was. "I love you," she whispered against his lips, the words a final, definitive break from the past. Draco froze for a heartbeat. He had never heard her say it so clearly, so without the context of a crisis. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his grey eyes shining with a fierce, beautiful clarity. "I know," he said, a faint, arrogant smirk touching his lips. The old Draco, but filtered through a heart that had been broken and rebuilt. "I've seen it in the mirror." She laughed, a bright, melodic sound that filled the flat. He kissed her again, longer this time, a slow-burn embrace that promised a lifetime of mundane Tuesdays and quiet mornings. The enemies to lovers' arc had reached its final destination. They were no longer defined by the war, or the manner, or the blood purity that had once sat between them like a wall of ice. They were just Hermione and Draco, two people who had found each other in the dark and decided that the light was better. Outside, the city of London moved on. The ministry debated new laws, the shops in Diagon Alley opened their doors, and the world continued to spin. But inside the flat, the silence was perfect. It was a silence filled with the warmth of the fireplace and the steady twin heartbeats of two souls who were no longer lost. The mirror on the table caught the morning sun, reflecting a small golden patch of light onto the wall. It was a reminder that even the most shattered things could be made whole, and that sometimes the most important reflection isn't the one you see in the glass, but the one you see in the eyes of the person who refused to let you go. The story ended, not with a grand gesture, but with a shared cup of coffee and a quiet promise. The find was over. They were home. The roses in the manor garden would bloom in the winter, just as they had planned. And here, in the heart of London, the boy from the mirror and the girl who saved him were finally, truly free. Their reflection was clear. Their hearts were full. And for the first time in their lives, the future was not a mystery to be solved, but a gift to be opened together.
Thank you for staying with me until the end. This story is about a mirror, but it is really about us. We all have moments when we feel trapped. Sometimes we feel like ghosts in our own lives. We feel that our past is too heavy. We feel that no one can truly see us. But then someone looks closer. Someone stays when it gets dark. Hermione and Draco were enemies. They had every reason to walk away. But they chose to look past the glass. They chose to see the person, not the mistake. I wanted to show that love is not a fairy tale. Love is work, it is patience, it is choosing to stay in the room when the silence is loud. If you are feeling lost today, remember this: the glass can be broken, the shadows can be fade. There is always a way back to the light. You just need someone to help you find the key. I hope this story gives you a little bit of warmth. Until next time, keep looking for the light.